Now, multiplication is similar also. However, you don't use X like you do in math. You use the star symbol. Okay? Here's an example of using multiplication to calculate tip. So we take bill times 20%, and that gives us the tip. And then we add the tip to the bill, and that gives us the total bill. So we can combine these operators to do useful things. Okay, everybody with me? So addition, subtraction, there's no cute symbols with multiplication. It is what it is. But just remember, use the star instead of the X. Okay? Okay, now it's going to get a little murkier now. You ready? The symbol for division is the slash. Okay? Couple of things with division. Let's just take an example of something that would work. So give me an example of where I might use division. Where might I use division? I'm sorry? Okay, so I have a bill and I have 3 people, okay? So let's say we say amount owed equals bill divided by num people. Okay, so that's a good example where I would take my bill, divide it by the num people, and figure out how much everybody owes. Okay? So division, fine. Okay? We have 2 issues with division that makes it a little funkier. All right? The very first one is something you probably already know. You can't divide by 0. Is it legal? I don't know. God said on the 9th day, you know, whatever. We can't divide by 0. It's not valid. Okay? So this means as a programmer, you have to make sure that this does not happen. So if you did something dumb like this, you know, you would get an error from, maybe the compiler would catch you, but either way, it would tell you there was an error. But let's say that you ask the user, what's the potential problem there? Tyler? Yeah, what's to stop them from entering 0? Right? They can enter 0, and then you would get a runtime divide by 0 issue, which is not a good thing. So what do you think as a programmer you should do about this? You have an idea? Okay. Okay. Okay, good. Jared? Yeah, so what we need is an if statement. Okay? Now I'm skipping ahead a little, but you're actually going to do this in your lab too. So I'll show you how to do it, but next we don't do ifs for another week or so. Okay? But I know you're smart, so you'll be able to get this. Okay? So what I would do if I was going to fix this, I would say if, what am I checking for? And then what should I do if it's not 0? Go ahead and do my calculation, which was amount owed equals total bill divided by num people. Now, so we're skipping a little bit ahead, but I know you're smart, so I know you can see this. What this if statement is doing is if they enter an invalid value, first of all, 0 is bad. Why did I also not want it to be negative? Well, I could divide by negative. I can't have negative people. It doesn't make sense. So it's not because the 0 is because it's a mathematical restriction. The negative is a reasonableness issue. I can't have negative people at a table eating dinner, okay? So that doesn't make any sense. It's not valid, so I'm not going to accept that. So if the number of people is less than or equal to 0, I'm going to print a message, and I will not execute this line. If I get here, I know that the number of people was greater than 0, and this will do the calculation. Does everybody see this, even though we're going to spend more time with ifs coming up? You do have a little bit of it. I'm going to, in the lab tomorrow, you have to do an if. So that's why, I'm going to give you the if, but I want you to see what it looks like. Okay? Now, that's the first issue with division, divide by 0. We always, as a programmer, need to make sure that the user cannot inadvertently divide by 0. That's our job. That's our job. Always check to make sure divide by 0 cannot occur. We have a second issue. And the issue has to do with types. So if I take x and I take 5 divided by 10, why is this telling me I'm going to get a 0 if I say x equals 5 divided by 10? Colin? Okay, good. So what type is 5? Integer. What type is 10? Integer. When I divide an integer by an integer, what type of division will take place? Integer. Okay? So typically we don't have to think about it. The operator determines what type based on the operands. Okay? There's not 2 division symbols. There's only 1. And the division will determine what type of operation to do based on the 2 operands. Okay? So how do I fix this issue? I knew somebody was going to say that, and I'll do it, but that's wrong. Okay? So let's say I make x as float. Let me repeat the question. What type is this? Integer. What type is this? What type of division is it going to do? Still integer. Do you see the problem is I have not solved the problem. The problem is not changing the type of the answer. The problem is changing the type of these 2 guys. One of these 2 guys. Ideas. I could, okay? Hold that thought, hold that answer, because I want to see if somebody else, because that is the correct answer. What else could I do? Ace? Yeah, so one thing I could do, which is kind of kludgy, okay, I could change it to 5.0 divided by 10. So let's see why this works. Okay? What type is this? Float. What type is this? When I divide a float by an integer, what type of division takes place? Float. So that would actually work. But I'm not crazy about that because the 5 is really supposed to be an integer. So what Donald suggested is something you wouldn't have known unless you've seen the language before, is to do something called a cast operation. Excuse me. Okay? And what that means is for the purpose of the operation, you temporarily cast one of the variables to force the operation to take place the way you wish. So what that does is it just temporarily casts the 5 to float. So this type of division will be float. Question? Well, since I need a float answer, I do want x to be float. So he was partially correct in making x be a float. Okay? It just didn't solve the whole problem. Now, okay, how are we doing with this? Sort of, kind of? Ask me a question. I feel rumbling. Okay, so when I did this, okay, so this was not a problem with addition, because if we add 2 integers, what do we get? You know, if we add a float and an integer, it'll go to float. So it's not a problem. it's only when you try to do two of the same. The reason it's a problem with division is because when I take an integer divided by an integer, I get a float answer. But the operator determines what type of operation to perform by looking at the two operands. This is integer, this is integer. So it's only going to do integer division. So the answer is 0, okay? Because that's an integer answer, all right? Let's look at this one, too. Let's keep going. Let's do 3 divided by 2. What would the answer be for 3 divided by 2? Truncates. It truncates, by the way. 1. 1. Okay? So the operator determines what type of operation to do by the two operands. If both are integer, it's going to perform integer operation. So I'm going to kind of fake it out. I'm going to temporarily cast this variable to be a float, just for the purpose of the it's not a variable, it's a constant. Typically, I wouldn't do this with constants. I just wanted to show you the whole numbers. Here's a more reasonable example. You know, forget this. I probably wouldn't do 5 by 10. I mean, I don't put that in a program. Let's look at an actual example and see if this makes sense. So let's say I want to take the average of 2 test scores. And the test scores are integer. So what type should average be? What type, if I'm averaging my test scores, what type should average be? Yeah, I want my half point, right? I mean, you don't want this to be integer, right? You don't want your GPA to be int, okay? So average is going to be float. So if I now say average, there's actually 2 issues going on here. If I say test score 1 plus test score 2 divided by 2, what's the problem that's going to happen? Exactly. If by some chance they're even, I would be okay. But these are all integers, and it's going to take int divided by int, and I'm going to miss my half point, which I probably want. Okay? So does everybody see? Even though this is float, these are all integers, so it's going to do an integer divide. So how can I solve that issue? I'm going to cast float right in front of this guy so that it forces a floating point division. Now, I could change test score to float, but that's kludgy. If test score is truly an integer, don't change it, declare what it should be. Does that make sense? Okay.